About 6 years ago, my grandkids came to me with this big, exciting request. They wanted watermelons, not from the grocery store. They wanted to grow them right here in my garden, the way we grow our tomatoes and peppers and everything else. And I remember looking at my modest backyard setup and thinking, there is no way. Everything I had ever read about watermelons said you need massive space, something like 25 square feet per plant. And if you are growing a full sized variety, you're looking at 100 square feet just to get four plants in the ground. I did not have that kind of real estate. And honestly, I almost told them we would have to pick a different project. But something about the challenge got under my skin. You know how it is when someone tells you that you cannot do something. And I started digging into the research to see if there was a way to make it work on a smaller scale. And today I am going to walk you through every step of how I grow sweet watermelons in small spaces, including containers. I will explain the science behind each decision so you understand exactly why it works, and I have a bonus tip at the end about a simple pollination trick that completely transformed my fruit set after a season where I got zero melons. Zero. So stick around for that. My obsession with small space watermelons really started from that moment with the grandkids. But what kept me going was a realization that most of the conventional advice about watermelons is written for people with big rural gardens or actual farms. When you start asking why watermelons supposedly need all that space, the answer is really about vine spread and root competition. But if you choose the right variety and manage the environment, you can work around both of those factors. That insight changed everything for me, and the results have been consistently good ever since. The very first decision, and honestly the most important one, is choosing a variety that is actually suited for small space growing. And this is where a lot of people set themselves up for failure before they even put a seed in the ground. When most folks think watermelon, they picture those big oblong crimson sweets or Charleston Greys that weigh 20 to 30 pounds. And those are wonderful melons, but they need enormous vine runs and long growing seasons, often 100 days or more. What you want for containers and small gardens are icebox types, compact varieties that were specifically bred to produce smaller, intensely sweet fruit on shorter, more manageable vines. Sugar Baby is the classic choice and the one I started with. It produces round melons in the 6 to 10 pound range on vines that are far more contained than a full-size variety, and it matures in about 75 to 80 days, which is a huge advantage if your growing season is on the shorter side. Since then, I have also had fantastic results with Bush Sugar Baby, which has an even more compact growth habit, and Mini Love, which is a personal-sized variety that produces these adorable little 3 to 5 pound melons that are perfect for two people. Here is something I find genuinely fascinating about these smaller varieties. They often taste sweeter than the big ones, and the science behind that makes perfect sense. A smaller melon concentrates its sugars into less flesh, so the ratio of sweetness to volume is actually higher. It is the same reason a tiny wild strawberry can taste more intense than a giant grocery store one. If you're in USDA zones 5 through 9 and you have at least 80 to 90 frost-free days, you can absolutely grow these compact varieties successfully, and in warmer zones you might even squeeze in a second planting. Once I settled on the variety, the next thing I had to figure out was the container. And this is where watermelons differ pretty significantly from something like onions or herbs. Watermelons send down a taproot that wants to go deep, and they develop a wider root system than you might expect for a vine crop. So you need real volume. I would not go any smaller than a 20-gallon container. 25 is what I actually use and recommend, because anything less and the roots run out of room. The soil dries out too fast, and the plant just never has the resources to produce a decent melon. Depth matters here. You want at least 14 to 16 inches of soil depth so the taproot can establish itself properly. For material, I have tried just about everything over the years, and I keep coming back to fabric grow pots for one specific reason. They prevent the root zone from overheating. If you are growing on a patio or a driveway, a black plastic container sitting in full sun can push soil temperatures well above 100 degrees, and roots start to shut down at that point. Fabric breathes, lets air prune the roots, and keeps things significantly cooler. One trick I discovered almost by accident is to elevate the container an inch or two off the concrete using a couple of pieces of scrap wood or a simple plant caddy. That tiny air gap underneath prevents heat from radiating up through the bottom of the pot, and the difference in root zone temperature is genuinely noticeable. I measured it one summer with a soil thermometer, and the elevated pot was nearly 8 degrees cooler at the bottom. Make sure whatever container you choose has plenty of drainage holes, and if it does not have enough, drill more. Watermelons need consistent moisture, but they absolutely cannot sit in standing water. Now, the soil mix is where things get really interesting because what you put in that container directly affects not just how big your melons get, but how sweet they taste. You need something loose, rich, and free draining, similar to what I use for other container crops, but with a couple of key adjustments. My base recipe is roughly 1/3 high quality compost, 1/3 perlite, and 1/3 premium potting mix. And then I add about a cup of coarse sand per container to boost drainage even further. The compost is doing the heavy lifting nutritionally and biologically. All those microorganisms breaking down organic matter and making nutrients available to the roots. But here is where watermelons differ from a lot of other fruiting crops. Early in their life cycle, they are extremely heavy nitrogen feeders. The plant needs to build a big, healthy leaf canopy before it can even think about setting fruit, because those leaves are the solar panels that will power everything that happens later. So at planting time, I work in a generous application of blood meal, along with a balanced granular fertilizer, and that fast-acting nitrogen from the blood meal gives the plant an early boost, while the granular releases more slowly over the coming weeks. Then, once I start seeing flowers, and this is the part most people miss, I shift away from nitrogen and toward phosphorus and potassium, because now the plant's job changes from growing leaves to developing and sweetening fruit. Too much nitrogen at the flowering stage, and you will get a gorgeous, sprawling vine with tons of foliage and very little melon to show for it. I use a simple bloom-type fertilizer at that point, something with a lower first number and higher second and third numbers. And the difference in fruit quality has been remarkable. Planting and early care might seem straightforward, but there are a few details here that I think make a real difference, especially in containers. Watermelon seeds will not germinate well in cool soil. You really want the soil temperature to be at least 65 degrees Fahrenheit before you sow, and 70 to 75 is ideal. I check mine with a simple probe thermometer because air temperature can be deceiving, particularly in spring when nights are still cool, but the afternoons feel warm. In each container, I plant 2 seeds about an inch deep, and once they are both up and have their first set of true leaves, I snip the weaker one at the soil line. I do not pull it out because that can disturb the roots of the one I am keeping. Even in a container, I plant into a slight mound, building the soil up an inch or so in the center because it encourages water to drain away from the stem and reduces the chance of rot right at the base of the plant. I also mulch the soil surface with about 1.5 inches of straw once the seedling is established, which does double duty. It holds moisture in and keeps the soil temperature more consistent. Early in the season, before nights are reliably warm, I push my containers right up against a south-facing wall. That wall absorbs heat all day and radiates it back at night, creating a little microclimate that can bump your nighttime temperature by 3 to 5 degrees. For a heat-loving crop like watermelon, that small advantage matters more than most people realize. Watering is where container-grown watermelons demand the most attention, and honestly, it is where the difference between a sweet, crisp melon and a flavorless, spongy disappointment is made. Watermelons are roughly 90% water. Think about that for a second. So the fruit itself is basically a reservoir, and if you're not providing enough moisture during the growing period, the plant simply cannot fill that reservoir the way it needs to. I water deeply rather than frequently, soaking the container until water runs freely from the bottom, and then I let the top inch of soil dry slightly before watering again. That encourages the roots to reach down rather than staying shallow near the surface. During the hottest weeks of summer when the fruit is actively sizing up, I am checking my containers every single morning without exception. And on days above 90 degrees, I sometimes check again in the late afternoon. That active sizing period, roughly from when the fruit is the size of a tennis ball until it stops growing, is the most critical window, and inconsistent moisture during those few weeks is what causes splitting. I had a beautiful crimson sweet split wide open on me one July after I forgot to water for 2 days during a heat wave and then drenched it out of guilt. and the rapid expansion of water uptake literally cracked the rind from the inside. The flip side of all this, and this is a detail that I think separates good watermelons from truly great ones, is that you actually want to ease off the water slightly in the final 7 to 10 days before harvest. Not a drought, just reducing frequency by about a third. What that does is concentrate the sugars in the flesh rather than diluting them with additional water uptake. I stumbled onto this almost by accident when I went on a short vacation late one August and came back to melons that were noticeably sweeter than anything I'd grown before. The science checks out. Less water in the final stretch means the same amount of sugar dissolved in less liquid, which your taste buds read as a sweeter melon. If you're finding this helpful, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I put out new videos every week where I break down the science behind growing better food at home. It is completely free, and it means you will not miss the next one. All right, let us keep going. Training your vines is what truly makes small space watermelon growing possible, and this is where I think container growers have a huge advantage that most people never explore. For compact varieties like Sugar Baby or Mini Love, a simple A-frame trellis or even a sturdy lean-to propped against a wall or fence works beautifully. I build mine out of basic 2x2 lumber and some garden netting, and the whole setup costs maybe $15 and takes about 20 minutes. The key is directing the main vine upward and then gently tying it to the trellis with soft fabric strips as it grows, never wire or twine, because those will cut into the vine as it thickens. Once the fruit starts developing, and this part is important, you need to support each melon individually with a fabric sling. I use old t-shirts cut into wide strips and tied to the trellis frame so the melon sits in a little hammock. Without that support, a 5-pound melon hanging by its stem will eventually crimp or snap that connection. And once the stem is damaged, the fruit stops ripening. I lost 2 melons that way my second year before I figured out the sling trick. The other piece of vine management that I think most small space growers overlook is selective pruning. I let the main vine and 1 or 2 strong secondary runners develop, and I pinch off everything else. Then I limit each plant to 2 or 3 fruit total. That sounds aggressive, but the reasoning is solid. The plant has a finite amount of energy, and if it is trying to ripen 6 or 7 melons simultaneously, none of them will get enough sugar to taste the way you want them to. Fewer fruit means more energy per melon, and that translates directly to sweetness. Sunlight and heat are the final pieces of the environment puzzle, and they are closely connected. You need a bare minimum of 8 hours of direct sunlight per day for watermelons. 10 is better if you can manage it, and this is not just about photosynthesis. The total light exposure drives vine growth and flowering, but it is the nighttime temperatures that actually trigger ripening and sugar development. And this is a piece of science that genuinely fascinated me when I first learned about it. During warm nights, we are talking temperatures in the low 70s or above, the plant converts stored starches in the fruit into sugars. If your nights are dropping into the 50s or low 60s, that conversion slows way down, and you end up with those pale, bland, almost bitter melons that taste nothing like what you were hoping for. This is why watermelons are a summer crop and not a spring crop, and why I do not even attempt them until nighttime temperatures are consistently above 65 degrees. Containers give you a wonderful advantage here because you can reposition them throughout the season to maximize sun exposure and heat retention. I have rolled my plant caddies from the east side of the patio in June to the south-facing wall by mid-July, just chasing that optimal light window as the sun angle changes. About 3 years ago, I had a season where my watermelon vines looked spectacular, lush, green, tons of flowers, and I did not get a single fruit. Not one. I was baffled until a gardening friend asked me how many bees I had been seeing on the patio, and the answer was almost none. The female flowers were opening, waiting to be pollinated, and closing without ever getting visited. That same summer, a different container developed a severe case of powdery mildew after a stretch of humid weather, and I traced it back to my habit of watering late in the evening when the foliage stayed wet all night. The perfect environment for fungal spores to establish. I switched to morning-only watering and started spraying a simple baking soda solution, about 1 tablespoon per gallon of water, every week or so as a preventive, and that knocked the mildew down dramatically. I also had one season where the fruit split almost as fast as it grew. which I already mentioned was an inconsistent watering problem. But the interesting detail I learned was that splitting is most likely to happen when the rind has started to harden and then a sudden rush of water causes the flesh to expand faster than that rigid outer shell can accommodate. It is essentially the same physics as a water balloon. And then there was the year I let a plant set 5 fruit because I was too excited to prune, and every single one of them stayed tiny, barely bigger than a softball, because the plant simply could not allocate enough resources to ripen all of them. Now, here is the bonus tip I mentioned at the beginning, and this one single technique probably saved my small space watermelon growing entirely. After that disastrous 0 fruit season on the patio, I started hand pollinating, and the difference was immediate. The process is about as simple as it gets. Watermelon plants produce separate male and female flowers. The males have a straight, thin stem and show up first, and the females have a tiny little swelling at the base that looks like a miniature melon, which is exactly what it will become. In the early morning, before about 9 or 10, when the flowers start closing, I take a small, soft bristled paintbrush. A cheap craft store brush works perfectly, and I gently swirl it around inside a male flower to pick up the pollen, then transfer that pollen to the center of a female flower. I hit 3 or 4 male flowers to load up the brush and then work my way to every open female. The morning timing matters because the flowers are fully open and the pollen is most viable before the heat of the day. The very first season I did this, I went from 0 fruit to 6 beautiful melons on 3 plants. And I have hand pollinated every single year since. If you're growing in a small space, especially on a balcony or enclosed patio where bee traffic is limited, this one technique is the difference between growing watermelon vines and actually growing watermelons. That is everything I have for you today. Gardening is one of those things where the more you learn, the more you realize there is to discover. If you found this helpful, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next one. Happy gardening, and I will see you in the next video.